copy counts, really fine-grained control. And again, the purpose of this is, oh, I'm sorry. I did page down here and not there. Sorry, I should have had this slide up while I was talking about those three things. So we have the geographic area, the local environment, and the authorized domain. And many, many other things. All right, so the purpose of this again is for the common interface. The common interface is an open interface, an unencrypted interface that's used. I think something's gone wrong here, so I think I could use some help here once again. That may be why it didn't page down. Thank you. So the common interface is an open interface, as I said, an unencrypted interface that's used in conjunction with pay TV in the DVB system, used in conjunction with conditional access programming, so that you can have a proprietary means of determining whether you paid for something, and then an open set of devices that can actually receive the programming after you've paid for it. This is a pretty cool idea. There's actually European legislation that requires some manufacturers to support the common interface on the grounds that it's very pro-competitive, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So again, it's not encrypted right now. If you pay for the programming, it gets decrypted, and then you can do what you want with it. People at DVB think this is horrible. They can't believe that anyone actually would have designed it that way, even though it was they who designed it. But they designed it back in the pre-DRM era, when we didn't know that these rights have to be enforced by technology. And so the obvious conclusion is that when they do the new version, they're going to have some intellectual property, trade secrecy, patents, and other things in the new version of their common scrambling algorithm. And they're going to license the devices that are able to interoperate with the new common interface. By default, they're going to forbid all recording. And that's the default state that they're going to start from. It's a bit different from what we have now, if any of you are using common interface cards in your PCs. And then later on, they're going to negotiate and figure out a way to enable some recording using a DRM system or policy expression system similar to or identical with CPCM. Okay, so why does the industry think it's okay to do this? First of all, they say, well, it's their content, so they're entitled to do it. Okay, even if they're not entitled to do it, they can. Because as a practical matter, if you have a particular kind of conditional access system that doesn't do these restrictions, that doesn't have the CPCM rules and policies and expiring recordings and whatever, then they can refuse to license their Hollywood movies or their sporting events or whatever for distribution via that system. For example, they can boycott CA systems that are not capable of enforcing these rules. And in fact, in the European pay TV market, there are some CA systems that are intentionally not compatible with the existing common interface. So in the existing market, the pay TV operators have the ability to decide whether they want to support common interface or not. And unfortunately, that fact gives the movie studios a lot of leverage, because they can say, if the new common interface isn't restrictive enough, we're not going to license things to those pay TV operators who choose to be compatible with the thing that we think is too permissive. And that's a big problem, and I don't think that I can really overstate how big a strategic problem that is. So again, it's a conscious decision to say that the current common interface is too open, needs to be made less open. You have devices like PCI cards that do common interface in a PC, and those devices couldn't be made in the form in which we know and love them. Basically, you have some amount of tamper resistance in conditional access, and just as with the US cable plug-and-play system, there's an intentional decision to spread the tamper resistance down into the device and down into your home. Right, so you have a smart card. The smart card is tamper resistant. It contains policies about making sure that people pay for things, being able to be turned off if you don't pay. So we can argue about that, but there's not much to be done about that within the pay TV model. There's got to be something tamper resistant if you're going to have a broadcast signal that only some people can receive. Okay, so then you have some crypto hardware that actually does the decryption, and that's tamper resistant too, because it's actually got the keys, and if it weren't tamper resistant, you could get the keys out and tell them to other people. Okay, so then you have a host device that this is contained in. And the host device is something like a computer or a set-top box. Now that doesn't have to be tamper resistant. It's not tamper resistant now, but this CI version 2 idea is, well, why not, right? Where's the harm? And then that device will be required to do DRM on its outputs and only talk to other devices that are licensed. And so you get this real infection of tamper resistance, of licensing, spreading into your home. And finally, DVB is working on a broadcast flag for Europe, and it's inspired by the US broadcast flag. And this is applicable to unencrypted, free-to-air DVB-T programming. So the US broadcast flag does this. There's a weird situation here in Europe because the public service broadcasters have a notion that it would be illegal for them to allow their programming to be encrypted. So they're asking for something called Do Not Scramble, which is a flag that says that you have to enforce DRM policies but without encryption because of their interpretation of the legal situation. This has led to really bizarre arguments at DVB about how you enforce DRM without encrypting stuff. Of course, the people other than public service broadcasters are saying, well, that's okay because we're sure not going to use that flag. We may use the flag that enables the restrictions, but we're sure not going to use Do Not Scramble. So whenever we complain about the fact that this is going to break lots of things that we enjoy now, DVB says, well, look, we're just defining some bits. We're not saying that anyone actually has to do anything with them. If there were someone else who wanted to enforce compliance here, well, they could try to do that, but that's not what we're doing. So you can't blame us. We're just, writing a spec for something. Someone might want to use it for something, maybe. This is, in fact, what the US ATSC Standards Committee said about the US broadcast flag. We're just defining a couple of bits of metadata. You can use them or not use them or whatever, and if any communications regulator happened to see them lying around and wanted to make a law saying that it was illegal to ignore them, well, that would be interesting. So there are some potential regulatory issues that are likely to develop. As I mentioned earlier, the common interface version 1 has a special status. Device manufacturers are required to support it. Pay TV service operators are not required to support it. This is actually the inverse of the US situation. In the US situation, cable companies are required to support cable plug-and-play, but hardware companies are not required to support cable plug-and-play. In Europe, hardware companies are required to support the common interface, but pay TV operators are not. This unfortunately produces a lot less leverage for consumers and a lot more leverage for movie companies because there's all this hardware that has to support common interface, but TV companies could just not do it if it doesn't do DRM restrictions. There is a question about whether regulators will recognize this restrictive proprietary CI version 2 as the legitimate successor of CI version 1 and what consequences that would have. And then with regard to the broadcast flag, will devices be required by law to obey the broadcast flag? And already the movie studios are saying that this is something that ought to happen. And this is something where regulation would be necessary and where they hope to or expect to advocate and ask for that regulation. If you talk about consumer protection issues, a lot of people say, well, we can just have some regulation to deal with that too. For example, if you think that this particular thing is too restrictive, we can say that in a particular member state, it will be illegal to apply that restriction to a particular kind of programming. This is all very abstract because no one is willing to go on record actually opposing any particular use of any restriction. But hypothetically, if you thought that some restriction were bad for consumers, you could have a hypothetical regulation saying that it couldn't be used in some circumstances. But in the status quo, we don't have any DRM at all. So if you put some DRM in and make all these devices get licenses and make all these devices become tamper resistant, and then say, some of that DRM sometimes can't be used by certain categories of broadcasters in certain countries, I don't think that's a very effective remedy compared to not doing DRM. So help. We're in a tough situation because over at the DVB project, ideas like people might want to use common interface in PCs and record stuff on their computers seems incredibly weird and marginal. Like, what? People watch TV on computers? I've never heard of that. And we say, yeah, they do. You know, I read it on the internet, and I met this guy who was working on a project. And they say, well, we sold 20 million units last year, and you just know this guy on the internet who is working on a project. So I think our 20 million units are more reality than your guy who's working on an open source project. So that's kind of a problem in terms of convincing people that this is even something that's real and worth worrying about. Also, pretty much everyone in industry doesn't object to DRM. Also, movie studios have a lot of leverage because they can say we're not going to license movies. Same thing for sports. People can say, if you don't get these restrictions in place, we're not going to let you have access to our cool content. And regulators don't have a lot of history of really aggressively resisting DRM implementation, as opposed to facilitating it, as many of you may know if you've been lobbying in the EU about DRM issues. There's a lot of pressure and a lot of difficulty. So I really would like to know what can be done about this, because we've been off arguing with people at DVB about it and saying that it's bad, and they've been saying, no, it's good. And that's where we are. These things are regulations and contractual developments, private developments that could come about, that could put a lot of DRM into DVB standards that currently don't have any. And I don't really know what we can do about it, and I hope that some of you do, because I'd very much like for it not to happen, and I wish I had a specific program and project about it. So I'll take questions or suggestions or comments or anything of that nature. And as we mentioned last night, EFF is going to be hiring a person in Brussels who's going to be doing lobbying at the European institutions level. So if any of you do have ideas or interest in this area, we are going to have someone here in Europe whom you may be able to work with and cooperate with on that. And I'm sorry again for the technical difficulties, and thank you very much for your attention. And I think we have only about 5 minutes, if I understood the signs properly. There's a microphone. Is it there?
Thanks. I have a question.
I think that...
Shall I go ahead? Go ahead. Okay, I'll go ahead. I think the main problem in terms of what can we do is the language and the way in which it's all being described. I mean, I think the problem really is one of communication. I think that even, you know, translating what you're trying to tell us with great passion and great kind of, you know, you're obviously really concerned about it. It's not really coming across perhaps as clearly as it needs to for the general public to become aware of the potential problems. So we held a meeting recently about DRM, and the solution suggested was to come up with some kind of clearer communication, like labeling. If you put on devices, you know, do you know that you can't do this? And I think it might be worth thinking about a communication strategy and going down that route, because it is actually, it's coming across as obscure when in fact it needs to be incredibly simple so that the general public start to object to the problems.
I think that's a great point. From my point of view, I took out a lot of acronyms, But there sure still are a lot of acronyms here. There sure still are a lot of fine details. And it does seem that if we can make things more